Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Usually, when we talk about a society collapsing, there is this expectation of a single identifiable earthquake, a massive invasion, or a singular catastrophic event. We look at the historical record, and we want to be able to point to a specific date and say, there it is, the day the empire fell.
Yeah, it is a very human tendency to want history to be binary, like a structure is either standing or it has fallen.
Right.
We like clear demarcation lines.
Right. But then you step into the world of medieval Japan, and suddenly that metaphor it does not work. We are looking at a political landscape that slowly hollows out from the inside.
It absolutely does.
So today we are doing a deep dive into a period of Japanese history where the rules of society literally evaporated. We are going to look at the sources, which include historical analyses, university course materials, and encyclopedic entries, to see what happens when the people at the bottom realize the people at the top are completely powerless.
It is a profound shift.
We are unpacking the Sengoku Jidai, widely known as the Warring States period. We are going to systematically trace the collapse of central authority, the radical evolution of military tactics and technology, and the ultimate reunification of the archipelago. For you listening, this is an exploration of how extreme fragmentation and chaos forced a society to completely rebuild its physical, social, and military structures from the ground up.
And to understand how completely the system dismantled itself, we really have to look at the institution that was nominally in charge before everything fell apart. That is the Ashikaga shogunate.
Okay, the Ashikaga shogunate.
Right. And to understand its fall, we have to examine its peak, which occurred under the third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. He is a crucial figure because he managed to end the imperial court schism in 1392.
Okay, let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. By ending the schism, he is negotiating the unification of the northern and southern courts, which stabilizes the regime's authority.
That is correct. He essentially brought the competing factions of the imperial family back under one umbrella, and that gave the Ashikaga Bakufu, that is the military government, a monopoly on political legitimacy.
Right, because there's no rival emperor to rally around.
Exactly. He also reestablished tributary trade with Ming China, which brought a massive influx of copper coins and luxury goods into the country. So this was a period of immense cultural patronage. The Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto, which was completed in 1408, was his retirement villa. It was specifically designed to project absolute, unassailable wealth and power.
The Golden Pavilion is such a perfect image of centralized wealth. But looking at the timeline in the sources, that wealth was highly unsustainable. After Yoshimitsu's death, the structural decay sets in really rapidly.
It does, very rapidly.
There is a specific tax system mentioned in the research called the Hansei system. Walk me through the mechanics of this. How did it function, and why did it ultimately break the government?
Well, the Hansei system was essentially a revenue-sharing agreement between the central government and the provinces. Tax revenues from the regional estates were supposed to be split 50-50. Half went to the shogun in Kyoto, and half went to the shugo.
And the shugo they're like the local lords.
They are the provincial constables. They were military governors appointed directly by the central shogunate.
So it is a standardized tax bracket, 50% to the capital, 50% stays local.
In theory, yes. But the fundamental issue was the physical logistics of enforcement. You see, taxes in medieval Japan were not paid via wire transfer. They were paid in physical goods, primarily rice.
Right.
And you have to remember the geography here. Japan is a nation composed of roughly 80% mountainous terrain. Moving thousands of tons of rice from a distant province to the capital in Kyoto is an absolute logistical nightmare. It requires carts, draft animals, security from bandits, and manageable weather.
Which means the people who control the physical collection of the rice hold all the carts.
Precisely. The shogunate relied entirely on the cooperation of these appointed constables to collect the grain, take their half, and physically transport the rest to Kyoto. But over time, these shugo began to realize they held the actual leverage.
Because they're the ones with the rice.
Yes. They had the armed retainers in the provinces, they had the local connections, so they just started hoarding the wealth, keeping much more than their 50% share.
If we look at this through a modern lens, it is like a franchise corporation. You have regional managers who suddenly realize headquarters does not actually have an auditing department or security. So the regional managers just stop sending profits to the CEO. Then they use that withheld money to hire their own private security forces, and they just start ignoring corporate entirely.
That is a very accurate way to frame it. The Shugo consolidated hereditary control over these regions. They were no longer acting as appointed government officials subject to transfer or dismissal. They were transforming these offices into private fiefdoms. And because the central government in Kyoto lacked a robust standing army to march out into the provinces and demand the missing tax revenue, they had absolutely no physical mechanism to enforce the Hansai system.
So they are completely cut off from the agricultural wealth of the nation. This leaves the central government effectively bankrupt.
Completely.
To survive, the sources show the shogunate becomes entirely reliant on irregular merchant levies. They start taxing pawnbrokers, known as dosu, and sake brewers, the sakaya, who operated right there in the capital.
They taxed the pawnbrokers and brewers because those were the only entities in Kyoto holding vast amounts of hard currency. Those copper coins imported from Ming China that we talked about earlier, the shogunate basically became a government that could only tax a few blocks of its own capital city.
Which is an incredibly fragile position to be in. And this structural financial weakness collides with a severe ecological stress. During the 1420s, the climate shifts. We see the effects of the Little Ice Age. Cooling temperatures cause widespread crop failures.
Right. A drop in average temperature by even 1 or 2 degrees is catastrophic for a rice-based economy. Rice requires very specific temperature thresholds and water levels to germinate and yield a proper harvest. When the temperatures dropped, the harvest failed consecutively. This led directly to severe famines in the 1420s.
Which in turn sparks massive peasant uprisings. The research notes major rebellions in 1428 and 1429. The rural population is starving, the regional lords are hoarding whatever grain is left, and the central government is completely paralyzed.
Exactly. These uprisings, known as duiki, were not just disorganized riots. They were highly coordinated attacks by rural coalitions, and their targets were the pawnbrokers and sake brewers in Kyoto.
Wait, why attack the brewers?
Because the peasants were marching on the capital to destroy the ledgers that held their debt records. The pawnbrokers and brewers were the moneylenders, so the shogunate was completely exposed. They could not enforce order to protect their own tax base in the city, and they could not extract resources from the countryside to alleviate the famine.
So the pressure is just building and building. And the absolute breaking point hits in 1441. The sixth shogun, Ashikaga Yoshinori, is assassinated by a disgruntled Shugo, Akamatsu Mitsusuke. And the motive here wasn't some grand ideological coup, right? The sources say it stemmed from grudges over the shogun trying to intervene in the Akamatsu clan's provincial succession affairs.
Yes, Ashikaga Yoshinori was actually attempting to reassert central authority. He was trying to act like a true ruler, dictating who would inherit which regional domain. But Akamatsu Mitsusuke simply invited the shogun to a theatrical performance at his residence in Kyoto and had him murdered during the play.
Just like that.
Just like that. That assassination fatally undermined any remaining illusion of shogunal prestige.
At what point does the title of shogun stop meaning anything at all? Because the institution continues to exist on paper for another century.
Well, the title becomes purely symbolic the moment the monopoly on legitimate violence is lost. When a central authority relies entirely on the cooperation of its regional delegates, and those delegates possess their own independent military forces, the center is a paper tiger.
Right.
The illusion of control was maintained for a few more decades, only because the regional lords found it mutually beneficial to pretend the center had power. It provided a convenient legal fiction for their own territorial expansion. The deputy shoguns, particularly the Hosokawa clan, began manipulating the shogunate councils purely to advance their own factional interests.
So you have this completely hollowed-out center. All it takes is a spark to ignite the entire structure. And that brings us to the Chonin War, which is widely recognized as the detonator for the Sengoku period.
The Arunwa ran from 1467 to 1477. It began as a localized succession dispute within the Hatakeyama clan, but it rapidly escalated into a massive proxy war between two of the most powerful regional lords in the country.
That is Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sutsun.
Correct. Hosokawa Katsumoto led what became known as the Eastern Army, and Yamana Sutsun led the Western Army.
Wait, I am trying to picture the scale and location of this, because we are talking about massive troop numbers in the sources, roughly 100,000 men on each side. But this isn't a war fought on wide-open plains across the Japanese countryside.
No, and that geographic concentration is the most defining characteristic of the conflict. You had 200,000 armed men packed into the urban environment of Kyoto. This was not a war of sweeping cavalry maneuvers. It was brutal, static, street-by-street urban warfare.
How do you even fight a war of that scale inside a 15th century wooden city?
You systematically dismantle the city to build fortifications. The armies tore down centuries-old temples, aristocratic mansions, and merchant blocks. They used the timber and stone to construct barricades and dig defensive trenches right through the middle of the capital.
Right through the street.
Literally through the streets. The opposing forces were often entrenched just yards away from each other. They would launch daily raids, set fires to smoke out enemy positions, and engage in constant skirmishing.
The destruction must have been absolute. The civilian population was largely forced to flee, resulting in a massive depopulation of the capital.
The fires alone erased generations of cultural heritage. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to ash. The economic heart of the nation was completely paralyzed.
I want to look closely at the motivations here, because the traditional framing of a war implies a calculated strategy to conquer and rule. Was the Yunnan War actually a calculated war for control of Japan? Looking at the timeline, it feels more like two massive egos trapped in a sunk cost fallacy. They destroyed the very political system they were fighting to control.
I would absolutely agree with that assessment. This proxy struggle was rooted in personal ambitions, complex marriage alliances, and court politics. It was not driven by a grand ideological vision for governing the archipelago.
They just wanted the puppet strings.
Exactly. Both Hosokawa and Yamano wanted to control the shogunal appointments. They wanted to be the puppet masters. But they committed so many resources and called in so many favors from their regional allies that neither could afford to back down without losing face and political leverage.
They just kept fighting until they literally couldn't anymore. And the ending of the war reflects that exhaustion. It is entirely anticlimactic. Both Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamano Tsusen die of illness in 1473.
Right. And without the two primary antagonists, the overarching strategic purpose of the war evaporated. The conflict simply sputtered on for a few more years as a series of localized vengeance feuds.
So the armies they just hang around.
For a bit, but by 1477, the exhausted provincial armies realized there was nothing left to fight over. They simply packed up their camps and marched back to their home provinces. They left Kyoto a smoldering ruin, and the shogunate was left completely devoid of any remaining authority.
The physical destruction of Kyoto really mirrors the destruction of the social order. With the old guard weakened by a decade of pointless fighting, the hierarchy completely inverts. This introduces the defining social phenomenon of the era, which the sources refer to as gekokujō.
Gekokujō translates roughly to the low overthrow the high. Or, more conceptually, the subordinate supplants the superior. While the Grand Lords, the Shugo, were bleeding their resources dry in Kyoto for 10 years, they left their home provinces in the hands of their local deputies, the Shugadai, and petty landowners, known as the Kokujin.
And these deputies realized that the lord in Kyoto isn't coming back with a strong army.
Exactly. The deputies realized they were the ones actually collecting the taxes, managing the local infrastructure, and commanding the loyalties of the local fighting men. They no longer needed to answer to aristocratic elites who derived their authority from a burned-down capital, so they simply usurped their absent masters.
There is a perfect illustrative vignette in the research for this concept, the story of Shizshun. If you're anything like me, your mental image of a warlord involves an ancient aristocratic bloodline. But Shizshun breaks that mold entirely. He starts out as a relatively minor samurai, originally named the Issei Shinkuro. He does not have a massive noble lineage to rely on.
He is the archetype of the self-made Sengoku daimyo. He began as a retainer under the Imagawa clan. Through a combination of administrative competence, strategic marriages, and, frankly, calculated betrayal, he built his own independent domain.
The defining moment for him comes in the 1490s when he conquers Sagami province and takes Odawara Castle. And he doesn't do it with a massive, overwhelming army. He does it through deception.
The historical accounts, while perhaps slightly romanticized over the centuries, illustrate his methods perfectly. He reportedly asked the Lord of Odawara for permission to allow his men to hunt deer on the castle's lands.
Just a friendly hunting trip.
Right. But once his men were positioned inside the territory, they abandoned the hunt, launched a surprise night attack, and seized the fortress. He supplanted the established Uesugi lineage and secured a vital stronghold in the Kanto region.
He becomes a warlord who owes his position purely to military success and tactical acumen, not to a court appointment.
And that is the essence of gekokujō. It was a ruthless meritocracy. It allowed highly capable, pragmatic men to seize control. But we must also consider the psychological toll of this system. It bred intense, structural paranoia.
Because if the only rule is that power belongs to whoever can take it, you can never turn your back.
Precisely. The new daimyo constantly had to monitor their own ranks. They had to balance rewarding their generals with enough land to keep them loyal, while ensuring no single general became powerful enough to launch a coup. They had to prevent their own subordinates from doing to them exactly what they had done to their previous masters.
So we have a society where Kyoto is destroyed. Betrayal is the baseline for political interaction, and you cannot trust ancient titles to protect you. The sources point out that with Kyoto destroyed and betrayal becoming the new normal, surviving this new era required a radical physical reorganization of how people lived and fought.
That necessity drove the widespread development of the jukamachi, or castle towns. Prior to the Sengoku period, a lord's domain was often highly decentralized. A samurai might live on his rural estate, collect taxes from his specific peasant farmers, and only travel to his lord's fortification when called up for a campaign.
But scattered rural holdings are impossible to defend when your neighbors might attack at any moment without a formal declaration of war.
Exactly. Therefore, visionary warlords like Takeda Shingen recognized the need for immediate, concentrated defense. They initiated a process of forced resource centralization. They demanded that their retainers abandon their rural estates and move their families permanently into the immediate vicinity of the lord's central castle.
They are essentially forcing the creation of proto-urban centers. They are not just moving soldiers, they are relocating artisans, farmers, and merchants.
It was a massive logistical undertaking. By moving the blacksmiths, the fletchers, the armorers, and the merchants to the base of the fortification, the daimyo secured their supply lines. If an enemy raided the province, the vital human capital and manufacturing base was insulated behind defensive walls. Furthermore, it ensured a heavily concentrated, easily monitorable tax base.
So they aren't chasing tax revenue across mountains anymore.
Right. Takeda Shingen developed his capital at Kofu as an early prototype of the system, integrating administrative halls, granaries, and armories around his central palace. It was a purely pragmatic adaptation to total anarchy.
As the town centralized, the architecture of the castles themselves underwent a massive evolution. We go from what are essentially wooden stockades to some of the most impressive fortifications in the pre-modern world. Walk me through the engineering here.
Well, the early fortifications were known as yamashiro, which translates to mountain castles. These were temporary defensive works. You would find a steep mountain, cut terraces into the slopes, dig dry moats, and erect wooden palisades. They were difficult to assault due to the incline, but they were vulnerable to fire and not designed for permanent, year-round habitation.
But as the warfare becomes constant, the daimyo need permanent headquarters that project power and withstand prolonged sieges.
This leads to the introduction of massive stone foundations, known as ishigaki. The engineering required to build these walls is really notable, particularly the technique of dry stone walling, or anozumi.
They are building walls that are 5 to 6 meters thick, using massive granite boulders, and they're doing it entirely without mortar. How does that even stand up, especially in country prone to severe earthquakes?
It stands up precisely because it lacks mortar.
Wait,
Yes. Mortar creates a rigid structure that cracks and fails under seismic stress. By carefully fitting unworked or roughly hewn stones together and packing the interior with smaller pebbles and gravel for drainage, the wall retains flexibility. During an earthquake, the stones settle and shift against one another, absorbing the kinetic energy.
that is incredibly clever.
It is. Furthermore, the walls were built with a concave slope, known as mushigeshi, or the warrior repeller. This curved incline made it incredibly difficult for infantry to climb, while providing immense structural stability against the weight of the earth behind it.
This architectural evolution culminates in structures like Oda Nobunaga's Azuchi Castle, constructed in 1576.
Azuchi represented a paradigm shift. It wasn't built on a remote, inaccessible peak. It was built on a hill overlooking Lake Biwa and crucial trade routes. It featured a massive multi-story central keep, the tenshu, rising above the stone foundations. The tenshu offered elevated visibility, platforms for defensive fire, and opulent residential quarters.
But building these thousands of stone fortifications across the country must have required an unbelievable amount of labor.
It imposed heavy corvée labor requirements on the peasant class. The daimyo essentially drafted the rural population to quarry the stone, drag massive boulders for miles using log rollers, and manually construct the earthworks. It deeply strained the agricultural economy, but it was viewed as an absolute necessity for survival.
And as the physical structures of war changed, the human element, the composition of the armies, shifted even more radically. We have to look at the underlying demographics. The population of Japan during this period booms to roughly 10 million people.
That demographic density is crucial. You have 10 million people confined to an archipelago where, again, 80% of the land mass is mountainous and unsuited for large-scale agriculture or cavalry maneuvers.
Those two factors, high population density and restricted flat terrain, dictate how a warlord builds an army. The era of the elite, aristocratic cavalry archer, which defined the earlier centuries of Japanese warfare, comes to an end.
Right. Cavalry is highly effective on open plains where mobility and flanking are possible. In the narrow valleys, dense forests, and mountainous passes of Japan, a small number of elite horsemen can be easily bottlenecked and overwhelmed. Warfare transitioned to mass infantry tactics because fielding thousands of foot soldiers was far more cost-effective and tactically superior for holding broken territory and controlling geographical choke points.
This is where we see the rise of the Ashigaru.
Yep.
Originally, these were just peasant levies, temporarily drafted for short seasonal campaigns. They would grab whatever weapon they could find, fight for a few weeks, and then return to their farms for the harvest.
But by the mid-16th century, the daimyo required standing armies that could fight year-round. The Ashigaru became professionalized. They were issued standardized armor, usually simple iron breastplates and conical hats known as jingasa, and most importantly, they were issued standardized weapons, specifically the yari, or pike.
I want to focus on the yari because these were not just standard spears. We were talking about pikes that were up to 5 meters long. If you look at the tactical diagrams in the sources, the visual is striking. For you listening, rethink your mental image of Japanese history. Sengoku warfare actually looked much more like ancient Greek pike warfare or the Macedonian phalanx than the popular image of samurai duels.
The visual of the lone sword-wielding samurai engaging in single, honorable combat is largely a romanticized myth codified during the peaceful Edo period that followed. In the brutal reality of the Sengoku Jidai, a sword was a secondary sidearm. The primary weapon of the battlefield was the 5-meter stick.
So how does a commander deploy thousands of men holding 5-meter pikes?
They organized them into dense, highly disciplined formations that were 10 to 20 ranks deep. The tactical shift here is profound. A dense block of pikemen presents a literal wall of spear points that can completely halt a cavalry charge. Horses simply will not charge into a solid mass of blades.
And the mechanics of the formation require absolute unit cohesion.
Yes. The front ranks drop to one knee and brace the butt of the pike against the ground, pointing the blade upward at an angle to catch charging horses. The ranks immediately behind them level their pikes over the shoulders of the men in front, creating a layered defense. It shifted the emphasis entirely away from individual warrior prowess and focused in on static defense, collective discipline, and aggressive, coordinated forward pushes.
Your survival did not depend on your individual swordsmanship. It depended entirely on the peasant standing shoulder to shoulder, with you not breaking ranks and running away.
Which is why drilling and severe discipline became paramount. Commanders had to train farmers to hold their ground in the face of terrifying noise and violence. But this reliance on massed infantry also created unprecedented social mobility within the military structure.
Because if a daimyo's survival depends on the effectiveness of the pike block, he needs competent officers to lead it, regardless of their bloodline.
Exactly. A peasant who performed well in the Ashigaru ranks, who showed tactical awareness and kept his unit cohesive under fire, could be promoted. Leaders like Takeda Shingen explicitly integrated these Ashigaru into their standing forces with merit-based promotion tracks. They appointed Ashigaru Taisho, commanders of the foot soldiers, who were often drawn from the ranks themselves. It completely eroded the traditional class hierarchies on the battlefield. Command was increasingly given to those who could win.
But there's a massive logistical drawback to this system. The Ashigaru were largely motivated by mercenary incentives, loot, consistent rations, and the promise of social advancement rather than deep-seated feudal loyalty to a specific lord.
And because of that mercenary mindset, desertion rates could be incredibly high. If an army was stalled in a prolonged siege and the rations ran low, or if the campaign stretched into the winter months, 20 to 30% of an Ashigaru force might simply melt away into the countryside.
By the 1580s, leaders were mobilizing forces surpassing 100,000 men. Supplying those masses, paying them, and keeping them fed in hostile territory required highly sophisticated administrative networks. The software of warfare, the logistics, the training, the command structure was evolving at a blistering pace.
And it was into this highly evolved, infantry-dominant tactical environment that a completely new, disruptive piece of technology arrived.
The gunpowder shock. Just as these massive blocks of pikemen became the standard of Japanese warfare, a ship blown off course introduced a technology that would test these new formations to their limits.
The date is generally accepted as 1543. A Chinese merchant vessel, which happened to be carrying Portuguese traders, was hit by a storm and blown off course, landing on the small southern island of Tanegashima. Among their cargo, the Portuguese had matchlock firearms, which were smoothbore arquebuses.
The local lord, Tanegashima Tokitaka, sees a demonstration of these weapons. He sees a metal tube fire a lead ball through a target at a distance. He immediately purchases 2 of these matchlocks for a staggering sum of silver. But he doesn't just put them on a wall as curiosities.
No, he immediately instructs his chief swordsmith, Yate Kinbei, to reverse engineer the firing mechanism and the barrel construction.
The speed of domestic mass production that follows is incredible. Within a few decades, Japan goes from having 2 matchlocks to producing thousands of them. How did they scale up manufacturing so quickly?
It was a confluence of geography and pre-existing industrial capacity. Japan possessed rich iron sand resources and a highly skilled class of swordsmiths and armorers who already understood advanced metallurgy. They knew how to forge strong iron. Furthermore, while they had to import saltpeter, they could mine abundant sulfur from their volcanic landscape to produce the gunpowder.
So they have all the ingredients domestically, essentially.
Basically, yes. Gunsmith guilds sprang up rapidly in autonomous merchant cities like Sakai, operating as commercial enterprises selling arms to the highest bidder. These weapons became known domestically as teppo, or simply Tanegashima.
The most famous deployment of this new technology, the battle that always gets highlighted in the military histories, occurred at Nagashino in June 1575. We have the forces of Oda Nobunaga facing the renowned cavalry of the Takeda clan.
Nobunaga understood the strengths and, crucially, the limitations of the matchlock. He deployed an estimated 3,000 gunners at Nagashino. But he did not just line them up in an open field. He positioned them behind staggered wooden palisades along the bank of a shallow river.
He used the terrain and the barricades to negate the momentum of the Takeda charge.
Yes. When the Takeda cavalry and infantry charged across the muddy ground, they were forced to slow down to navigate the barricades. At that exact moment, Nobunaga's gunners fired in coordinated, rotating volleys. The result was a slaughter. The Takeda forces suffered an estimated 10,000 casualties out of a total force of 38,000. It broke the back of the Takeda clan.
This battle is often framed as the moment guns replace swords and spears. But looking through the research, particularly the arguments presented by historians like Thomas Collin, there was a fascinating academic debate here. Did guns actually revolutionize Japanese warfare, or did they just layer onto the pre-existing pike and infantry organization we just talked about?
Conlon and other military historians argue convincingly that the introduction of firearms was an evolution, not a sudden revolution. We have to look at the mechanical reality of a 16th century matchlock.
Right. Walk me through the actual operation of the weapon.
It is an incredibly cumbersome process. A gunner has to pour a measured charge of black powder down the muzzle, drop in a lead ball, ram it all down with a wooden rod, prime the clash pan with finer powder, and then make sure the slow match, a smoldering cord, is securely attached to the serpentine mechanism.
And all of this takes time.
Under ideal conditions, a well-trained eshigaru might take 20 to 30 seconds to reload a single shot. In the chaos of combat, it took longer. Furthermore, the ignition mechanism meant the weapon was practically useless in heavy rain, as the powder in the flash pan would get wet and fail to ignite.
Which means if you're just standing in a field with a matchlock and you miss your first shot, an enemy with a spear is going to close the distance and kill you before you can reload.
Precisely. Therefore, the teppo could not replace the pike blocks. They were a supporting tool. They significantly enhanced ranged lethality, penetrating armor at distances where arrows lost their kinetic energy. But victory at Nagashino still relied fundamentally on the wooden fortifications, the marshy terrain, and the crucial subsequent counterattack by Nobunaga's own pikemen, who advanced once the Takeda lines were broken.
Let me try a technology analogy here. The introduction of the matchlock gun in Japan was not like inventing the smartphone, which completely upends how every facet of society operates overnight. It was more like adding a slightly better, longer-lasting battery to an existing machine. The true revolution was the organizational software, the massed infantry formations, the meritocratic command structures, the logistical supply chains that allowed the hardware of the gun to be deployed effectively in the first place.
I think that analogy holds up perfectly, though I would add that it forced commanders to rethink the geometry of the battlefield. It necessitated shallower, wider formations to maximize the number of guns firing simultaneously, rather than deep columns. Firearms augmented a system that was already prioritizing mass coordination over individual prowess.
While the handheld matchlocks get almost all the attention in popular culture, the research points out a completely overlooked element of Sengoku warfare. That is artillery. The Taihusho, and this completely upends my mental image of the period. We're not just talking about heavy muskets, we're talking about large-scale cannons.
Artillery is often neglected because it did not dominate the open field battles the way it did in Europe during the same era. But the Japanese were exposed to and quickly adopted heavy ordnance. The sources describe the Ferengi, which were bronze, breech-loading cannons introduced by the Portuguese, but eventually cast locally in Japan.
Let's unpack the mechanics of a breech-loading cannon in the 16th century. Some of these weighed up to 120 kilograms.
The Ferengi featured a heavy barrel mounted on a swivel, allowing for a wide arc of fire. Because they were breech loaders, the gun crew could swap out pre-loaded powder chambers at the rear of the weapon, allowing for a relatively high rate of fire compared to muzzle loaders.
But there is an engineering flaw with early breech loaders, right?
Yes. The breech cover was often secured with wooden wedges. When the black powder detonated, the seal was not perfect. Explosive gases escaped along the seams, significantly reducing the chamber pressure and, consequently, the range and penetrative power of the projectile. Still, they could effectively fire a 1.3 kilogram lead or iron ball.
And the Japanese did not just copy the European bronze designs. They developed their own massive muzzle-loading cannons called uzutsu.
The uzutsu were an indigenous adaptation. Instead of casting them in bronze, which required scarce copper and tin, Japanese smiths forged them from thick wrought iron using the same techniques they used to make sword blades. This made the barrels incredibly strong and capable of handling massive powder charges, but it also made them exceptionally heavy.
The research notes that some of these iron guns were 3 meters long. The heaviest recorded piece, manufactured in Sakai in 1610, weighed 135 kilograms.
And that extreme weight explains why artillery did not define open-field combat in Japan. Imagine the logistics of moving a 135-kilogram iron tube, plus the heavy wooden carriage, plus hundreds of pounds of lead balls and black powder, through heavily forested, mountainous terrain on dirt roads that turned to deep mud in the rain.
It sounds impossible.
It was a logistical nightmare. A highly mobile army simply could not drag heavy artillery with them on rapid campaigns.
But if they weren't used in field battles, where did these massive weapons actually make a difference?
They were absolutely crucial in naval blockades and prolonged sieges. For example, during the battles of Kizugo-Waguchi in 1578, Oda Nobunaga was trying to break a naval supply line feeding a heavily fortified temple complex in Osaka.
The Temple of the Ikikiki warrior monks.
Correct. Nobunaga deployed a fleet of Owatakabune. These were massive, heavily reinforced ships, essentially floating wooden fortresses, and he equipped them with numerous emplacements for heavy matchlocks and Ferengi cannons.
They just sail into the bay and act as floating artillery platforms.
They completely overwhelmed the opposing naval forces of the Muchi clan through sheer superior firepower. The cannons shredded the lighter enemy vessels.
And in siege warfare on land, how are they deploying these heavy iron Ozutsu?
They were used specifically to destroy the heavy wooden gates, watchtowers, and palisades of enemy castles. Because of the intense recoil of a 135-kilogram gun firing a massive charge, they were often mounted on sliding wooden frames designed to absorb the backward force, or they were literally tied down to piles of sand-stuffed rice bales.
And the gun crews must have been prime targets for the defenders on the walls.
They were, so the attackers developed specialized shielding. The gun crews operated behind thick, heavy bundles of tightly bound bamboo called taketaba, or behind thick iron plates, which could stop incoming matchlock fire from the castle walls while they laboriously reloaded the cannons.
So if we look at the big picture, you have centralized castle economies generating immense agricultural wealth. You have massed, merit-based infantry formations wielding 5-meter pikes. And you have the strategic integration of both handheld gunpowder weapons and heavy siege artillery. The toolkit for absolute conquest has been fully assembled.
And it just required leaders with the vision, the administrative capability, and the sheer ruthlessness to wield that toolkit on a national scale. Which brings us to the endgame of the Sengoku period, driven by the three unifiers.
Right. The process of reunification did not happen overnight. It occurred in three distinct, overlapping phases, driven by three remarkably different men. The first is Oda Nobunaga.
Oda Nobunaga was the hammer. He utilized the new infantry tactics and firearms to brutally break the power of the old regional domains, and perhaps more importantly, he crushed the militant religious sects that had operated as independent military states for centuries. He laid the foundation for unification through absolute, terrifying military force.
But Nobunaga is assassinated by one of his own generals in 1582, in a classic incident of gekokujō at the Haniji Temple.
Which leaves a massive power vacuum immediately filled by his most capable general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi.
Hideyoshi is the ultimate embodiment of the era's social mobility. He literally rose from a peasant background. He started as a sandal bearer for Nobunaga to become the absolute ruler of Japan. He finishes the military campaigns, but looking at his legacy, his most important contribution wasn't a battle. It was the bureaucratic project, the Taiko-kenchi.
The Taiko-kenchi were nationwide land surveys, and they were perhaps the most consequential administrative reform in Japanese history. Hideyoshi sent teams of surveyors across the entire country with standardized measuring rods.
Wait, they physically measured every single rice paddy in the nation?
Every single one. They measured the dimensions, they graded the quality of the soil, and they recorded the exact name of the peasant family responsible for cultivating that specific plot.
Why go to that level of bureaucratic obsession?
Because it completely standardized taxation. By knowing exactly how much rice a piece of land could yield, the central government knew exactly how much tax they could extract. But more deeply, it locked the social structure in place.
How so?
By tying a specific peasant to a specific plot of land, Hideyoshi fundamentally ended their ability to act as roaming mercenaries. If you were recorded as a farmer, you farmed. If you were recorded as a samurai, you fought. He confiscated weapons from the peasantry in the famous sword hunts, permanently separating the warrior class from the agricultural class.
He used bureaucracy to pull up the ladder of social mobility that he himself had climbed.
Exactly. He ensured that no other peasant could ever become a warlord.
But Hideyoshi's system faces a crisis when he dies in 1598. He leaves behind a massive unified military machine, but he leaves a glaring vulnerability at the center. His heir, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, is only 5 years old.
Hideyoshi anticipated the danger. Before his death, he established a council of the 5 most powerful regional lords, the regents, who were sworn to rule cooperatively until the boy came of age. But the moment Hideyoshi died, the political gravity shifted. The alliances immediately began to fracture based on old grudges and new ambitions.
This sets the stage for the third unifier, Tokugawa Ieyasu. He was the most powerful of the regents, a man who'd patiently built an immense power base in the Kanto region, far from the capital.
The country rapidly splits into 2 massive opposing coalitions. On one side, you have the Western Army. This is led by Ishida Mitsunori, a brilliant bureaucrat and loyalist who forms a coalition ostensibly dedicated to protecting the young heir, Hideyori, and preserving the Toyotomi legacy.
And on the other side, you have the Eastern Army, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu. He gathers generals like Fukushima Masanori and Kato Kiyomasa, men who were veteran commanders under Hideyoshi, but who harbored deep personal animosity toward Ishida Mitsunori's bureaucratic influence. I want to make sure we pause here and note how the historical research frames this conflict. The texts present the political maneuverings of both Ishida and Tokugawa simply as historical strategies for power. We are reporting this impartially. The research does not endorse either side's claim to moral legitimacy. It was a pragmatic clash of alliances, fighting for ultimate control of the national infrastructure Hideyoshi had built.
Right. Both sides spent months utilizing every diplomatic tool available: marriage promises, land grants, hostage exchanges, and veiled threats to draw regional lords into their respective camps.
This tension finally snaps and culminates at the Battle of Sekigahara on October 21st, 1600. The battle takes place on a small, foggy valley plain in what is now Gifu Prefecture.
The sheer scale of this engagement is staggering. The sources place roughly 170,000 men on the battlefield that morning. This is the ultimate deployment of massed infantry, synchronized firearms, and cavalry on a scale unseen in earlier periods of Japanese history. It is the culmination of a century of military evolution crashing together in a single valley.
I want to analyze the tactical situation here. Ishida Mitsunori and the Western Army actually arrived first. They occupied the high ground surrounding the valley. They had a numerical superiority of roughly 82,000 men, against Tokugawa's 74,000. They had a clear, advantageous position. So given all the technology and tactics we have discussed, was Tokugawa's ultimate victory really a result of superior military application, or was it simply superior backroom politics?
Oh, it was undeniably the politics. It was the weaponization of human psychology. Tokugawa Ieyasu had spent months before the battle secretly communicating with commanders inside the Western Army. He exploited their personal grievances against Ishida.
He is writing letters and offering bribes while the armies are literally marching toward each other.
Yes. The decisive moment of the battle had nothing to do with matchlock volleys or pike formations. It centered on a young commander named Kobayakawa Hideaki, who commanded a massive force of roughly 15,000 men positioned on Mount Matsuo, looking directly down at the flank of Ishida's army.
Kobayakawa is officially part of the Western Army.
Officially, yes, but he had been negotiating with Tokugawa. For the first few hours of the battle, as the fighting raged in the valley below, Kobayakawa did absolutely nothing. He just watched, weighing his options, waiting to see who would gain the upper hand.
The tension must have been unbearable.
Eventually, Tokugawa, growing impatient and needing to force the issue, ordered a squad of matchlock gunners to fire directly up the mountain at Kobayakawa's position. It was a blunt, terrifying demand for an answer.
And that gunfire breaks a paralysis.
Kobayakawa makes his choice. He orders his 15,000 men to charge down the mountain and smash directly into the right flank of his own allies in the Western Army. This mid-battle defection triggered a cascading collapse. Other wavering commanders in the Western Army immediately switched sides as well. The Western Army disintegrated.
So the Eastern Army won not because of better matchlocks or superior armor, but because the foundational rule of the Sengoku period betrayal was weaponized flawlessly by Tokugawa.
The battle was decided before a single sword was drawn. It was just executed on the field of Sekigahara.
The immediate aftermath of this victory shapes the entire geopolitical future of the country. Tokugawa claims absolute victory, and he begins the process of completely reassigning the domains of Japan. He measures out rewards and punishments using a very specific metric, the koku.
We talked earlier about Hideyoshi's land surveys assessing the yield of rice paddies. The koku is the standard unit of that measurement. One koku is roughly equivalent to 150 kilograms of rice, historically defined as the amount needed to feed one adult man for a year.
So a domain's value isn't measured in square mileage. It is measured purely by its agricultural output, its economic engine.
Exactly. A domain's koku rating determined everything: how much tax they owed, and exactly how many soldiers, horses, and weapons they were legally required to provide to the shogun upon request.
And Tokugawa uses this metric to radically redraw the map.
The redistribution is sweeping and ruthlessly calculated. For example, he takes a general like Ikeda Teramasa, who fought valiantly for the Eastern Army, and reassigns him to a massive 520,000 koku domain in Harima province.
That is immense wealth and power.
But more importantly, look at what he does to his enemies. He strips massive tracts of land from the lords who opposed him, and geographically he surrounds the capital, Kyoto, and the crucial trade routes with his most loyal hereditary vassals, the Fudai daimyo. He takes the lords whose loyalty is questionable, the Tozama daimyo, the outside lords, and banishes them to the extreme peripheral edges of the archipelago.
He physically engineers the map to ensure that even if his enemies wanted to rebel, they lacked the geographic proximity and the agricultural wealth, the koku, to raise an army large enough to threaten the center.
This precise, systemic restructuring of physical land and economic power directly lays the administrative groundwork for the Tokugawa shogunate.
The dust settling at Sekigahara truly marked the end of the bloodiest century in Japanese history.
It did. The systems of mass mobilization, the standardization of taxation, the forced centralization of the castle towns, all these tools forged in the chaotic fires of the Sengoku period provided Tokugawa with the exact administrative machinery needed to lock the country down. He instituted strict laws governing everything from castle repairs to marriage alliances between daimyo, effectively preventing another Sino war from ever happening again.
Which leaves us with a profound paradox to ponder. The Sengoku Jidai was a century of total anarchy. It was an era where the established order completely evaporated. Peasants became lords, retainers routinely murdered their masters, and centuries of traditional rules were entirely erased in the pure, pragmatic pursuit of survival and power. Yet it was precisely this crucible of absolute chaos that stripped away the rot of the old system. It provided the blank slate necessary to forge the Tokugawa shogunate, one of the most rigidly controlled, peaceful, and bureaucratic societies in human history. The ultimate legacy of 100 years of relentless, devastating war was the absolute guarantee of peace for the next 2.5 centuries. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.